I've been asked this question frequently, and I figured I'd go ahead and make a writing room episode about it. The question is it ever bad to use tropes or cliches? And if so, then how far can it go before it's too far? And this is a good question to ask because I think that tropes and cliches are things we are trying to look for these days in writing. Now before we begin, let's discuss what tropes are. The word trope comes from the Greek word tropos, which means a turn or a change in direction. These days, though, tropes refer to specific literary devices or figures of speech that we've come to recognize as things repeated or used in commonplace in literature. When you start to notice similar patterns in the works of authors and writers, you're noticing these tropes in effect. For example, in country westerns, it's a classic trope that bad guys wear black hats and good guys wear white hats. In fantasy, chosen one tropes are very common, where a specific protagonist is chosen or destined to save the day and defeat evil. Tropes and cliches often get called out in this day and age as a sign of lazy or poor writing, but I 100% disagree with this. Tropes can actually be tools of great writers. By using a trope carefully or subverting it in a unique or creative way, a writer can play with the expectations of its audience. Now, what do I mean by this? Let's do a little bit of a game here. Let's practice this. I'm going to adjust the visuals on the screen and the ambience. Listen. It's nighttime. The moon is out, and you're walking through a forest. You hear the screech of an owl, and you slow and careful your footsteps through the underbrush. You hear the sounds of the night, and a cold breeze whips at your face and sides. You suddenly spin around fast. You heard something moving, but you see nothing. No one's behind you. You start to walk backwards, quickly this time. Your heart is pounding faster as you walk. You calm yourself. No one's there, you tell yourself. Nothing is behind you. And yet the more you force these thoughts to your mind, the more you feel you can hear something. You turn and start running. Don't look back. Don't look back. Maybe if you shut out the sound, the thing will go away. You're breaking into a sprint. You hear the movement getting louder. Up ahead you see your cabin. Your home. It's safe there. Of course it's safe there. You break into a sprint for the cabin and rush to the door. You grab the handle fast and yank it open, and then you hear a scream and a flash of light. Surprise! Happy birthday! You look around and see your friends and family standing around you with a cake and streamers and presents in hand, and behind you, jumping through the door behind you, is your loyal dog who had followed you home from the store, whose black fur had made him so hard to see in the dark. You see what happened there? The trope here was obvious. It's a horror trope. We know enough about horror to know that in this scenario, on a dark night in the woods with something chasing you, obviously this is supposed to lead to a scary scene. The person runs to the house and rips open the door, only to find a killer there, or a gory mess, or a monster, or something terrifying. But instead we subverted the expectation entirely by making it into a light-hearted scene. This is just a quick example I threw together last minute, but it gets the point across. Tropes are all mental. They are things we expect. In the words of Hideo Kojima, the story does not trick the reader tricks themselves. We build up an expectation based on things we are familiar with. The subversion of tropes can also be a very clever way to play with audience expectation. This is often done through comedy. Let's say you have a scene where there's a glass and china shot with a lot of breakable objects. Suddenly, a fight breaks out in this store and the two characters are now punching, kicking, and throwing each other around. Well, we expect something in this store to break. But what if by the end of the story, not only does the fight lead outside without anything breaking at all, which is subversive itself, but when the owner breathes a sigh of relief and leans against a pillar to relax a moment, the pillar falls over and breaks everything anyway. Now that's good comedy and good subversion. But note that the story didn't trick or deceive the reader or viewer. The reader's expectations were played with. I recently watched the short film or pilot of Lackadaisy, which is a story that takes place in 1920s St. Louis. In the scene, there was this really good scene where I thought that the trope was going to mess with me, and it did, where we have a scene where the good guys are driving away in a car, and this mysterious stranger with a pistol who kind of gives off this air that he's really dangerous, really skilled, really above everyone else. He pulls out the pistol and aims it, and I thought for sure this sharpshooting guy, he was going to get the hit when no one else could. No one else has landed a shot so far in this episode. I thought he's going to land it. He's going to show how good he is, but he missed. He did not land the shot, and I was surprised. I thought he was going to get it. That was a minor subversion. Nothing big, but it was just enough to make me go, oh, I didn't expect that. it was well done, and it showed that he wasn't this super perfect, awesome shot that I expected him to be. So it was kind of neat that way. Now, I want to say this about subversion, though. Subversion alone does not necessarily mean that it's going to be good. In fact, you don't even need to think of subversion as necessarily a good thing all the time. In fact, if overused, subverted tropes can become tropes themselves. Such as, for example, the strong woman trope that's been coming up a lot. In the past, the damsel in distress trope was often subverted to have the woman save herself or save the man, or the woman would be the one who was strong in the story. And, okay, that was clever for a while, but now it's not only been done so frequently we expect it like any other trope, it's added onto itself the idea that men are weak, evil, or useless, which has become its own trope, which can be annoying for a lot of audience members. I should also point out that just because you subvert a trope doesn't mean it's always going to be good. One of the common praises for The Last Jedi is that it subverted our expectations, that we would never have seen this movie coming. But this defeats the purpose of good subversion. Subversion should somehow make sense. It should feel warranted. For example, in The Last Jedi, Luke Skywalker is portrayed to be an old, cynical, cranky, hopeless hermit and loser who wants the Jedi to die and doesn't even shed a tear for his friends who he chooses to abandon. Which is in complete contrast to who Luke was in the original trilogy. Now, is that subversive? Yeah. It's not at all what I expected. But is it good? No. You see, it makes no sense to see a character make this sudden twist, and it doesn't provide the audience with a satisfactory alternative. It doesn't take Luke in a creative direction, it only serves to act as a stepping stone to prop up Rey's character. Bad writing at its finest, but masked with the praise of subversion. To put it one way, I wouldn't have expected Luke and all of his friends to suddenly turn into snowmen. I wouldn't have expected it. Doesn't mean it's good. Now, what about if you don't use subversion? Can a trope still be good even without subversion? Absolutely. I mean, of course they can. But the key with a trope is to make them fit so well you don't notice or care that they're there. If you notice a very blatant trope, it can take you out of the immersion. And I'll give you an example. James Cameron's Avatar had a very heavy get back to nature, capitalism, bad man, bad message that we've seen repeated so frequently that the film felt weak despite the incredible CGI and effects. A lot of people have said it's basically Pocahontas but in space, and that is such a good example of what I'm talking about. People noticed it. They said, oh, you're just using the Pocahontas movie. You're doing the Pocahontas thing. The getting back to nature trope, the man saved by the savage trope, all this kind of stuff. And they were right. They were 100% right, and that ruined it. The man, bad, nature, good trope was so blatant that we couldn't feel invested in the story because we could see the pandering on screen. Now, I'll admit, I enjoyed Avatar mostly for the effects and the atmosphere and scenery and for the designs of the characters. But again, for the story itself, yeah, it was pretty bad. But let's try another one. Let's do one that's good. For those of you who like One Piece, I know, I talk about it all the time, bear with me. But one of the most notable and memorable arcs is the Enies Lobby arc, where Luffy and the crew go to war with CP9 and the world government to rescue Nico Robin, their friend. This whole arc drips with tropes. The tragic backstory trope, the damsel in distress trope, the sudden obtaining of powers, Deus Ex Machina, the sins of the father, and various others. And I'll bet you likely hardly noticed or cared while watching the arc because the arc was so well written. It was well paced, it was entertaining, and it never stopped you to make you think, oh, the obvious sins of the father trope was spawned, or oh, the Mary coming to save them is such Deus Ex Machina. I mean, I for one never noticed these on first watch or cared. Even when I sat down and thought about it, I was kind of like, oh, well, it worked. I didn't have a problem with it. I didn't go, oh, this is taking me out of the experience. I never thought that. Because the trick is subtlety. Have a story before you have an intended message. Have the tropes cleverly woven into the story or presented in a way meant to surprise or shock the audience. It's like painting a picture. You already know what you want to paint, but how you do it is what matters. Tropes are, in the end, very tricky. It's not that you shouldn't use them, not at all. It's that you must use them well. I mean, tropes are unavoidable. They're ingrained in our storytelling styles and in our habits, but how are you incorporating them? Are you going to subvert them in a creative way that the audience will find endearing? Are you going to craft a story so entertaining that we don't mind the tropes? Or are you going to beat us over the head with the trope so viciously that the rest of the story falls flat on its face? See, that's the thing. If I notice the trope overlapping the story, and I have to go, oh man, we're really doing this, that's quite often the line you say when you notice a trope. We're really doing this. If you hear an audience member say, this is what's happening, odds are pretty good they've been dragged out of the story because they're looking at a trope and going, yep. It's actually kind of funny. My dad and mom have been watching this TV show, and I can't remember what it's called, but every time I visit with them, they say, Raven, you need to write this show yourself, because 3 minutes into the show, we knew exactly where it was going. And there it is, right there. When you can look at a show and know exactly what it's up to, exactly what it's planning, when you see how the magician performed the trick, when you see how the artist made their final product, you know. It's like, you just know, and by that point it's like, this show it's gonna be dull, it's gonna be bad. But I think that's all I really should say right now. The way you handle the trope or the cliche is the real issue. Tropes and cliches aren't the problem, it's how you handle them. It's not something you can or should master right away, by the way, because I'm sure some people are gonna say, well, like, how do I do that? How do I do that? It's not something you should get right away. Like all things, it takes time to handle carefully and to learn how to weave these naturally into a story. You need to take it step by step. Practice writing the trope. Look at the trope in other ways. Examine it. There's a lot that goes into this, and that's the beauty of the art of writing. I would say take your time and be patient with it. Think about how you want to tell your story and be conscious of what tropes you're going to see in it. That will be the best advice I can give you. But that's all the time I have today for this writing room. I will see you in the next one. Take care.